Welcome back. Just a heads up with the upcoming videos. We're going to be talking about Next.js and building our apps. I'm going to start off with an older version of Next, and then at the end, we're going to update to the latest version to just show you the update process of what you would do as libraries evolve. Now, one quick change is that Next.js was recently acquired, or at least they got investment from an outside firm and now renamed themselves to Vercel. So you might notice this naming change instead of Next.js, although most people still use this naming. Now, an interesting thing has happened in the industry where both Next.js and Gatsby.js both have received VC funding, that is money from the outside, to try and make these companies profitable. And both of them, what they offer are what we call hosting or platforms that you can run your apps on. For example, if you're building an app that is Next.js, you can deploy it to Vercel here and they host the website for you instead of you having to manage your own server. Same with Gatsby. Gatsby is trying to be the next WordPress and they provide Gatsby Cloud, a place for you to perhaps host your Gatsby blog. Now, I don't want to get too much into the details, but I do want to let you know of those changes. But I have a fun exercise for us. Now, up to this point, we have learned about things like React, Gatsby, Next.js Vercel. We learned about client-side rendering and server-side rendering. But do you really understand this topic or the idea of what the differences are between these things? I wanted to show you a diagram that might help explain and decide for yourself which tool to use. Now, in this diagram, we have the client, that is the website that, let's say, our user is going to visit, so their own computer on their browser or their mobile phone. We have the server that serves the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files, and then we have us as the developers working on the computer. Now, looking at this diagram, where are the three locations that computers can or have to do work? Well, hopefully this was easy to answer. The first part is the user visits our website, right? And they request some information to the server and the server responds with something. So the first place that does work is the client. So the client, whatever browser they're using, whatever device they're using, does some work to try and retrieve those files. And once they retrieve those files, well, they would use something like React to run the JavaScript file on the client to do some work, to display something useful. So React client-side rendering says, hey, I'm going to do the work on the user's phone. Why is this good? Well, it's good because we're not doing the work. We're not paying money on the server to do the work. And the client, hopefully they have a powerful device, can display more quickly than if we went back and forth, back and forth. So that's the appeal of client-side rendering and maybe using React on the front end, on the client side. The second place we can work on is the server. And that's the beauty of server-side rendering. Instead of saying, hey, let the client do the work, let the JavaScript run on the client so that they create the DOM nodes needed for them to see information. Instead, when the client sends a request, we have a really powerful server that's going to do the work for us and in return is going to run the JavaScript here and then return the HTML or whatever information we want to the client so that the client's device doesn't have to do as much work. So there's some benefits to that. But then here's the thing. The third one is our laptops as developers, right? Before we even put our files on the server, our HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files, we could technically do some work on our own machines before we put them onto the server, right? So that instead of the user having to wait around for either their client device or the server, we could perhaps save a bit of work for them because, well, we aren't in a rush, maybe like a user, but instead we can do as much work as possible on our machines, upload those files to the server so that both the client and the server do minimal work. And this is where something like Gatsby.js shines. Gatsby is a static site generator. What that means is that they can generate the HTML files with JavaScript that we run before we put them on a server. And that's why Gatsby is good for a blog post. I can write a blog post, and our website doesn't change that much because it's just blog posts. I can run it through Gatsby before I even deploy it. Gatsby is going to understand the JavaScript file that we wrote, plus the HTML and CSS, combine it to create blog posts. And then we put those files, mainly the HTML and CSS files, on the server, and it just sends those HTML and CSS files, maybe with just a tiny bit of JavaScript, to the client. So the client does little work. The server does little work, so that hopefully it's a good user experience. On the other hand, Next.js would work on the server. They say, hey, the server is where we want all the work to happen. At the end of the day, all these tools, and what you have to decide as a developer, is this question: where do you want the work to happen? And that's what we're trying to figure out. It's your decision to decide, do we want the client to do the work? Do we want the server to do the work? Should we do most of the work on our machines? There's no right answer to this. Every problem requires a different solution. But hopefully, seeing these three places that we can do work, you start to understand the value that React and client-side apps offer, the value that Next.js and server-side rendered apps offer, and even what static site generators like Gatsby offer. I'll see you in the next one.